So I think it's about time for us to get started. Thank you everybody for coming. My name is Jason Chen. I'm the postdoc here with the Center for Ethics and Human Values and the College of Pharmacy. And today's event is on the underregulated supplement industry, and we are very privileged to have two excellent speakers here with us today. The main speaker is Dr. Pieter Cohen, who is the Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. And commentating is Patricia Zettler, who's Associate Professor at Moritz College of Law. Okay, and so I don't want to take any more time, so let's give our attention to our speakers. All right, let's begin with you, Dr. Cohen. Thank you.
Good morning. So can you guys hear me? Great. So just so I get a sense of who's here in the audience, could you guys tell me how many of you are graduate students of pharmacy, studying pharmacy, graduate students? Anyone? No. Undergrads? Okay, great. And for the non-undergrads, do you guys mind telling me what you're studying? If you're faculty or grad students? Faculty. In what area? Pharmacy? Okay. So we got undergrads. In undergrads, you guys are studying. I see you're like sitting together. That's nice. First of all, so you guys are studying pharmacy. You guys are.
No.
No, you're like undergrads, like haven't figured it. No.
Health sciences on a pre-PA track, but I'm taking the class.
Great. And you guys maybe just still thinking about it?
It's my mind.
So most of the undergrads are probably pharmaceutical sciences. They might be pharmaceutical science minors. Our PharmD program is set up as a professional program, so you need a 4-year degree to matriculate into the program. So are there any PharmD? You said graduate, but I didn't know if there were any professional students. Okay. Yeah, there might be. So we have no undergraduate pharmacy, like pre-pharmacy type folks, but they're in pharmaceutical sciences and others, and some of them may have interest in a pharmacy.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sorry about all the questions, putting you guys on the spot. You're trying to get here lunchtime, relax, not have a class, and then it's just, So it's helpful for me to try to, so I know what you guys might have learned about already. So basically, I'm just going to give very briefly, maybe 10 minutes or try to keep it to 10, 15 minutes of what's the current regulatory framework for supplements that might be for you guys, and then for the faculty, maybe ideas about where we could go from here if we had the momentum to make changes. So for the regulatory framework for supplements, the history is that back in the 80s and even earlier than that, there's always been this tension between who should regulate. It really was focused on vitamins. So imagine vitamins being sold at a little mom and pop shop. And that was always outside of any sort of significant FDA purview. So these were just being sold in the 1960s, 1970s at mom and pop little supermarkets, pharmacies. What happened was that there was a movement in the, again, 70s and 80s to try to promote very high dose vitamins. So like very famous people like Linus Pauling said, hey, mega doses of vitamin C can cure whatever. And it just, went on this sort of like promotional tour. And there were many, many books and ideas about this. The idea that very high doses of individual vitamins could have curative effects. What happened at that time was that the FDA became concerned about the health effects of that. So this was hard for like the public really to understand, because supplements have this sort of like, we know that if you have a deficit in individual vitamins, you can have very severe disease. So, and then replacing those vitamins bring people back to health miraculously. So that's sort of like in the public sphere. Vitamins like can cure people. People might not be walking or not be able to, their skin might be falling off, and then boom, they're cured. But here, the situation was giving very high doses of individual vitamins can also be dangerous, and that's absolutely the facts. And the FDA was trying to figure out how can we keep consumers safe. So they started making some moves to state that very high doses of supplements, individual vitamins, more than like 2-3 times the daily requirement, needed to go through a special evaluation process by the FDA to be sold in the mom and pop shops. Well, that created a lot of tension between the people who are already openly selling these supplements without any sort of like approval or safety evaluation, and led to a very large backlash. It was both a backlash from the like individual consumers who want access to it, and also was driven by consortiums of these small markets and stores and systems. And they pushed back on the FDA and said, they made, and it became a very big advertising campaign with like famous actors being hired to do commercials, saying that what the FDA is trying to take away vitamins from you, like not allow you to be able to consume vitamins. And that really worked. That campaign putting tons of pressure on the FDA. It's one of the times that the FDA received the most letters in sort of pushing back against something. And what happened was that the Congress, to basically tell the FDA they needed to stay away from supplements, wrote the current law. The current law is the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, which was passed in 1994. And that is the current framework that we're working on. The current framework is that the companies are 100% responsible for the quality of their products, for the safety of their products, and the FDA is in the position of needing to identify dangerous or adulterated products and then get them off store shelves. But the FDA was not given within the law a system in which that they could detect those dangerous supplements. So it's a very awkward position that the FDA is put in. So they technically are 100% regulating the supplements. Dietary supplements are regulated by the FDA. They were moved out of they're not in so the FDA has many different big parts, but two big distinctions between their drug, hand cedar, and their food part of the FDA. Supplements were moved out of the drug side onto food, so they're regulated like food, but because they're pills and powders taken for our health, they're really drugs. So it's a very complicated situation. They're regulated by the FDA, but it's a very weak regulatory framework that they have. So that's basically what's going on in terms of the framework that was passed in 1994, and that hasn't changed at all since then. And then the other thing is about their marketing, the marketing ability. So what the law also did was that it said that you can market these vitamins and minerals for anything, for a lot of things, for health. So it's not like, so one option would be to say, if you're trying to balance consumer access with safety, you could also potentially think, well, let's just put the vitamin on the label and sell it. So like you could buy vitamin C in the store, or you could buy vitamin D or a multivitamin. But what the law did, it went further and said that you could sell your vitamin C or multivitamin, or you name it, with with something called structure function claims, which are the ability to say that it will help the your health as long as you stick to certain language. Doesn't suggest it's a drug or a medication. So this means that you can say these vitamins will maintain normal sugar levels or maintain a strong immune system, as long as you avoid saying things like this will treat diabetes or prevent diabetes. So from a consumer perspective, this is very confusing, because if you are looking, as a consumer, if you're looking at a dietary supplement bottle and it reads this will maintain normal sugar levels, everyone with diabetes knows that that's going to help their diabetes. But from the law's perspective, the companies can do that without any need for any clinical research whatsoever demonstrating that that product can maintain normal sugar levels. So that's kind of crazy, but that's written into the law, making that entirely legal. So that's sort of the state of affairs. So now to what might be done to fix the situation, we're pretty much, right now, there's not too much momentum to make things change. There have been some proposals. And there's a few different, maybe 3 different points I'd like to think about that might be realistic changes. I would love to see, one thing that's not realistic, which would be really important, would be to eliminate that structure function ability, the ability to sell something based on structure function claims without any evidence in humans that they actually work. That doesn't make any sense to me. However, from a legal perspective, and Patty can discuss this further, I don't think there's any ability to move in that direction. My sense is that the civil rights movement of corporations is one of the most successful of these last 100 years. So I don't think we're going to have any much ability to tell the companies what they can't say. They'll probably have ability to do even more. So so I would love to see that change, but I don't think it's possible. One idea that's possible that people have been floating around is the idea of that, as I mentioned, the FDA is supposed to take off adulterated and dangerous products off the market, but they have no functioning system to know not only which are the products that are dangerous, but they don't even know what products are on the market. So no one even knows if there's 60,000 or 90,000 dietary supplements on the market, for example, because no one has to tell the FDA once they start selling the products. A company does need to register their manufacturing operation with the FDA, but after that, they could make 1 brand or they could make 100 brands, and they could be changing what's in those 100 brands every month if they wanted to. So the FDA has totally lost track of what's out there, and it's very hard to regulate a space when you have no idea what products are on the market. So one proposal that does have widespread support is a registry, a label database, whereby supplement manufacturers would need to submit to the FDA the information about their supplement prior to going onto the market, and the FDA keeps track of all this. The problem is that when it comes down to the details, there's a big tension between what industry would like, parts of industry would like to see none of this because they think it's extra paperwork and it's not going to make a difference and just cause more expense for them. Part of the industry thinks this is a good idea because it would make it crystal clear to consumers that the FDA is regulating these supplements, and it would further make the point to consumers that they're safe if they appear to be more clearly regulated by the FDA. And then there's a lot of public health experts who think this is a good idea. Now, the problem is that the problem is with the details of the database, how this would operate. What the industry would like to see, the part of the industry that is interested in seeing this database happen, would like to see all the information go to the FDA. The FDA is in the job of basically being like a super secretary, putting it all together, creating this cool database that any consumer can just look up at any time, all their products. So it's basically like creating a library of products on the FDA's own website. That's the industry's approach. My perspective is that's not going to do anything other than further give the industry an opportunity to advertise their products, because now not only can they make these structure function claims on the bottle, but they can do it, they would be able in that new world to have it written right in the FDA's website. So you could see that vitamin A is maintaining a normal immune system on this product on the FDA's own website. That to me is not moving the needle in any helpful way. So, but I do see that a registry giving the information to the FDA might be very beneficial, because if the FDA had new authority to read that label prior to the product coming on the market and deciding that all the ingredients listed in the label were legitimate supplement ingredients, like just that seems like so basic from, I guess, a common sense physician's perspective, but that's like a really controversial, extremely controversial, and the industry does not want to accept that, because that, in their opinion, creates a pre-approval process for dietary supplements arriving on the marketplace. But nevertheless, I think there's potential for compromise there. If the FDA were to read the labels confirm that just on the label, they're not actually analyzing the products, just on the label it looks legal, then they registered it in their website. They would also need a mechanism to be able to deregister it, unlist a product fast if they found there's research or findings that either it was causing harm or it was adulterated. In both those situations, if they had a button to press and they could take it off their list, that would be great, in my mind, and serve a public health function. None of that would really matter if this was just some like virtual thing happening on the FDA's websites, because no one would pay any attention to this and consumers would just keep on buying the products. So I think that in my perspective, and this again is completely opposed by industry, the only way that something like this could actually have a public health benefit is if once a product is registered at the FDA, that it has a whatever, unique identifier kind of code, one of those codes we scan into our phones, and you could be in the store and pick up the supplement and scan the code and be like, oh, it's registered at the FDA right now. And even better, if when you're trying to buy something online or in stores, that it wouldn't even be able to cash out if it didn't have the proper code, like i.e. registered with the FDA. If you had a robust system like that, that basically helped enforce the current laws, but created a way so consumers could know if it was listed with the FDA, and the FDA could make sure they could get rid of products that were adulterated or dangerous fast, that we could see progress on that front. And yeah, I think for the purposes of today, it's good. Let's just stop with there in terms of reform. There's other opportunities, I think, for reform, but that's the one that's most closest to the surface. In terms of that becoming any sort of law, there was a watered-down version of this that I did not support that was added on to, so every year, every few years, the FDA user fee?
5 years.
Yeah, 5 years. Every 5 years, so there's a big law that needs to get passed every 5 years in order for the FDA to continue getting funding from pharmaceutical companies for their work. And there was an attempt to create a watered-down version of this listing bill and add it to that required bill that was just passed a few months ago. But what happened was there was a lot of different groups from cosmetics and over-the-counter drugs and everything that was trying to get their pet projects also onto that FDA user fee. And the Congress got fed up with the situation, just said, we're going to delete everything that's not related to directly funding the FDA off of the bill, and it got scratched. So there was a watered-down version that had a slight opportunity of being passed in the past year, and right now everything's sort of dead in this because no one knows exactly what the next move is going to be. But anyways, so that's the thing that's most recently been percolating as ideas for reform. So.
Well, thank you so much. As Jason mentioned, I'm Patty Zettler, and I'm an associate professor here at Ohio State's College of Law and a faculty member of our Drug Enforcement and Policy Center in the Cancer Control Program at the James Comprehensive Cancer Center. For those of you that are undergrads, if you're interested in law school, please feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy, or chat after this. I'm always happy to chat. I gave a talk for undergrad students who are molecular genetics majors just a few weeks ago, and I've talked with a bunch of them in my office about law school, so just feel free to reach out. So I'm going to talk, I think, relatively similar to what Peter was talking about, but with the gloss of a lawyer. So I first want to touch on what actually is a dietary supplement under the law. I think if you think about yourselves as future practicing pharmacists rather than, or even as future lawyers, as I'll encourage you to think of yourselves, it's important to understand that, in short, what is labeled as a supplement in stores is typically much broader than what is actually lawfully permitted to be marketed as a supplement. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy trade-offs of the current system we have that Peter was talking about, but more from an innovation lens than from a sort of patient safety lens. One quick add-on I want to say is that one thing I like about that registration idea for reform is that under U.S. law, under 18 U.S.C. section 1001, it is a federal crime to give the federal government false information in a required report. So if a supplement company were required to report the ingredients in its product to the FDA and it submitted knowingly or willfully a false report to the federal government, that is already a federal crime under federal law. FDA would still need, I think, authority to revoke registration quickly, but there could also be federal criminal penalties attached to that. So what is a dietary supplement under federal law? The 1994 law that Peter mentioned added a definition to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act for supplements specifically. And one thing to keep in mind is that, and I think Peter's comments touched on this, but one thing I emphasize with my law students is that all agencies, including FDA, are creatures of statute. What that means is agencies aren't free to do whatever they feel like. FDA is not free to do whatever it'd like with respect to its mission of protecting and promoting public health. It can only do what Congress has authorized it to do. So we, the people, through our lawmakers, tell agencies what it is they can and can't do. And so Congress has made a policy choice to limit FDA's authority with respect to dietary supplements, as Peter described. But so Congress created this definition of a dietary supplement in federal law. So what is a dietary supplement? It's basically a product intended to affect the structure or function of the body that contains dietary ingredients. But there are a number of exclusions. So one thing is that are excluded is any product that's not intended for ingestion. So maybe, perhaps especially the undergrads among us may have seen nicotine-free vaping, vitamin vapes. So you can vape vitamin C. Typically, these products are labeled as supplements. They cannot be lawfully marketed as supplements because they're not intended for ingestion. They're intended for inhalation. Another limit in the statute is that you cannot lawfully market a supplement that has a drug active ingredient in the product. So that's an active ingredient that's either in an approved drug or is currently being studied under an IND for drug approval. This means every CBD supplement you see is not lawfully marketed as a supplement. CBD, there's an approved prescription drug called Epidiolex that has CBD as an active ingredient. It's intended for 2 rare seizure disorders. You can't market CBD as a supplement under federal law currently lawfully, though, of course, we all know that there are lots of those products out there. Another limit is what Peter mentioned, which is that companies can lawfully market supplements for structure function purposes, so maintains the immune system, but you can't lawfully market a supplement to treat or prevent disease. Those are drug claims that makes the product a drug. And how FDA interprets that is actually much broader than I think how Peter described it. So in FDA's view, maintains healthy blood sugar levels is actually a disease claim, and that makes your product a drug because everybody knows blood sugar means diabetes. So it can be an implicit or an explicit message that suggests your product is a drug. So I think an important thing to keep in mind as consumers, but also as future pharmacists who may be advising patients, is that all of the products you see out there that are labeled as supplements, they're not necessarily actually supplements under federal law, and often some of these products might be unapproved drugs under federal law, even if FDA hasn't taken an enforcement action. Or something like that. So the universe of what Congress envisioned to be marketed as a supplement is narrower than the universe of products that we do see marketed or labeled as supplements currently. And that is probably largely a result of FDA's limited enforcement powers. So Congress, as Peter mentioned, created this scheme in 1994. It's really a quite light regulatory scheme, and if we think about it as compared to drugs, probably we all know that new drugs cannot be marketed in the United States without FDA approval for their intended use. And in order to get that approval, companies have to show that their product is safe and effective for its intended use, and they have to show effectiveness through what's known as substantial evidence. That basically means companies have to collect a tremendous amount of information and typically conduct clinical trials to show that their product actually does what they say it does. And this one reason we have this scheme for drugs is that it protects patients physically from unsafe and ineffective products. Another reason we have this scheme is that gatekeeping role that FDA plays has an innovation or information forcing function. So basically, if without this requirement for this information production, we don't tend to actually get the information to understand if a product does what a company claims it does. History teaches us companies don't do that hard work to actually come up with something that really works for what they say it works for if they're not required to. To paraphrase a former FDA commissioner, Margaret Hamburg, it's not innovation if it doesn't work, right? We don't just want products for product's sake. We want products that do what they're supposed to do. And so that's one reason we have the FDA approval regime in the drug space. So in terms of thinking about the trade-offs we've made in the supplement space, this is a massive industry, as Peter mentioned. I think you may know better off the top of your head, but I think predictions are, or estimates are, it was about over $50 billion. U.S. People in America spent over $50 billion a year in 2020 on supplements, and it's expected to exceed over $100 billion by 2030. And so this is a massive industry that people are spending a lot of money on. And so, we might say, well, there is this access desire, right? People want to be able to buy supplements. Whether we'd want to be able to buy supplements if we weren't all subject to the marketing that's out there is a separate question. But the reality is, the practical reality that Congress and FDA are operating in is that people want access to supplements. So there's that piece of it. But then there is this sort of innovation side of it, right? Where if we don't require companies to study what, say, CBD does, we might lose out on the opportunity to really reap the potential of those products if they do have real sort of potential for treating disease or preventing disease, or even things that aren't disease related, cognitive enhancement, for example. I think in addition to the safety concerns that are raised by light regulation, especially as companies come on the market with new dietary ingredients about which, or new products about which we might have genuine innovation hopes, I think we have to sort of be cognizant of the policy trade-off we're making by allowing robust consumer markets without the kinds of research we expect for medical products if we do think that there are potential hopes for these ingredients to actually have the effects that are claimed. So I think I will stop there, and I guess we have questions.
Yeah, so no, I think it's a good time to start the Q&A session.
Can I just add
yeah,
one
absolutely.
clarification? Because I think it's often, we're so like immersed in this that we're thinking about how products are marketed, but sometimes as like, for you guys, it's really hard to know if you see something in a store, if it's being marketed, even marketed. So as Patty mentioned, it might not be legally marketed, but even pretends to be marketed as a supplement. The key is looking for a facts label. So basically on the behind all like packaged food, all packaged dietary supplements, all packaged over-the-counter medications like Tylenol and Prilosec, they all require a facts label. So check a look at that facts label, and it's the name of the facts label that's the key. So for food, it'll say like nutritional facts. For supplements, it'll say supplement. I don't know, I think supplement facts, and then over the counter it'll say drug facts or drug information or something. So basically, keep a close look at that panel of information where it gives like the nutritional information, and it's the label of that signals to you if it says supplement facts, this is something being sold as a dietary supplement, and that's what we've been talking about today. Because oftentimes something can, in the United States, be sold as a traditional food, as a supplement, or even an over-the-counter medication. And those things can like all overlap. It's very confusing.
Well, thank you for that. That was really educational. I'm going to ask the first question, because I've been dying to ask this. So I take like 1 million supplements myself. I want to know, and I think people are curious to know, how much faith should we have that these supplements actually contain the ingredients that they claim?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The problem is that because there's no FDA approval process, no one's checking whether or not the supplements contain what they purport to claim on the label. This means that we're really at the mercy of the manufacturer. and there's been many studies, some of which I've done as well, that have demonstrated that what's on the label is not what's in the bottle. So how do you get around this as a consumer who wants to take a multivitamin and you want those vitamins in it? There are a few very high quality third-party certification programs, and if the supplement manufacturer has hired those third-party manufacturers to assess their supplement, then you can't be assured that it's necessarily going to work as indicated, because they don't look at the claims, health claims, but they do look at this question that Jason's raising, or do they contain what's on the label? So the Defense Department has made recommendations for which groups to trust. So one example is US Pharmacopoeia, USP, has a great third-party certification. Another is NSF International, and there's a few other specialized ones for sports supplements, if you're interested. And the Defense Department has done a lot on this because the US troops take a lot of supplements, and often ones that can be potentially hazardous, ones like weight loss and sports supplements. So they've done a lot of work on trying to figure out what are the safest supplements and how US troops can find safer supplements, and I'd be happy to direct you to their website to help you learn more about this issue of how to find high quality supplements.
The other thing I would add is that FDA does take enforcement actions sometimes when it discovers that a supplement either doesn't have the ingredients it's supposed to have in it or is contaminated with ingredients that aren't listed, so like drug active ingredients. According to FDA, the three categories I think that are the most likely to be contaminated with drug active ingredients are sexual enhancement products, sports performance products, sports performance enhancement products, and weight control products. So those categories of products, you might just think carefully about. FDA's enforcement actions, typically FDA sends what's known as a warning letter, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a letter from the agency warning a company that company is violating the law. Those are all publicly available on FDA's website. So you could also search FDA's website to see if a warning letter has been sent to a specific supplement company or about a specific supplement. The absence of a warning letter, however, does not mean that the supplement doesn't have problems, because FDA doesn't take enforcement action all that often, I guess, relative to sort of the number of products that are out there.
Thank you for that. Yeah, let's open up to the audience. And if the speakers can repeat the question to the microphones, that would be great.
So typically for a company who has received a warning letter, how is the FDA actually alerted that they need to be looked at? And then how do they confirm that those products are actually either not or contaminated or don't contain the amount of product they say?
So it really depends how FDA, the question was, if FDA does send a warning letter to a company, how has FDA learned about the problems with the product and what happens after the warning letter? Was that the second part of the question?
Right, so do they actually confirm that the product is either contaminated or doesn't contain the right amount of product?
Okay, does FDA confirm that the product is contaminated or doesn't contain the right amount of product? So how FDA learns, I think it just kind of depends. FDA does monitor the market to the best of its ability, but as Peter mentioned, there are a lot of reasons why FDA's ability to keep tabs on the supplement market are limited. In terms of if the warning letter is asserting that the product is contaminated, typically there is actual evidence of that, so the agency would have tested the product. If the warning letter is asserting something like, you're marketing your CBD product to treat or prevent COVID, FDA doesn't have to test the product. It can just say, you can't market a supplement to treat or prevent COVID or the flu or, basically any major public health crisis you can think of. There have been supplements marketed to treat or prevent that disease, Zika, Ebola, etc.
I would just add that, so the one thing we haven't talked about yet, the FDA does do inspections of manufacturers. Now, their resources are very limited, so they can't inspect all manufacturers, but they go out and do this site visit. And that is a frequent way that warning letters are generated, because if they do a site visit And for example, a very common violation at the site visit of the law is that when a manufacturer, so what usually, there's many processes of this. Just imagine like most supplements are made, it's not like someone's picking echinacea on some beautiful bucolic hill, they bring it back, they wash it off, they use traditional methods, and then they sell it to you. Like that's what it looks like on the label, right? Because you see echinacea, it looks beautiful, and you're like thinking, you know, hundreds of years of health into my body tonight. And like, that's not exactly how it works. Like, imagine like echinacea is like, so there's this massive manufacturer somewhere making some powder. Maybe in the United States, usually elsewhere, like maybe in China. Make a huge amount of powder. And that powder gets imported to the United States maybe by one like in-between company. And then that in-between company is like selling it to a whole bunch of other companies. So you have this white powder that's changing hands a bunch of times, and then eventually some factory is like putting it into little pills and then putting that nice label on top, okay? Now, in that process, a lot of things can happen to that echinacea. Like one thing, it could have been not echinacea to begin with. It could be that companies decide to like save some money by putting some more filler in along the way and selling it to something else. So it's really like this. Just think about this as like white powder being passed around. And that's not to mention that like that echinacea initially, there's no requirement, one thing we haven't talked about in the law, is there's no requirement to create a traditional preparation. So in the, and I'm sorry I'm digressing here, but I'll get back to the violation in a sec. But this is an interesting point, that the law doesn't require that echinacea is prepared in any traditional way or any way whatsoever, actually. So to sell a supplement as echinacea, you just need to use any part of the plant, grind it up, dry it, boom, sell it as echinacea. But each botanical has a traditional historical use. It might have been a particular extraction of the leaves, for example, or the flower, not like, or the roots, but not like, it's not all the same, obviously, as we know. There's different chemicals in every part of the plant, but they're treated the same under the law. Now, so the law does require, so you can get away with a lot, but the law does require that if you bought echinacea that was passed through all these different hands and you're selling it, that you have to check, you have to do some scientific test to make sure that was echinacea, that powder you put into your supplement. And the most common violation that the FDA finds that the firms are not doing are doing that check. Running one scientific study to confirm that the powder that they purchased as echinacea is actually echinacea. That's an example, and then that would trigger a warning letter to the company and say you have X number of days to explain to us how you're going to fix that in your plant. So sorry about the digression, but I eventually got back to the violation.
All right, any other questions? Yeah.
So, I mean, in listening to you, I was thinking a little bit about I don't know much about the world of pharmacy and being a pharmacist, but I was trying to think about the responsibilities of the various parties and what you're talking about. So you talked about the responsibilities of manufacturers, you sort of touched on the responsibilities of consumers to look at the labels and sort of. But I started thinking, well, what's the responsibility of pharmacists in all of this? Because you might think, well, it's a lot for consumers to like keep track of who's received a warning letter or so forth. But you might think, no, this is a place where pharmacists should be playing an important role because they could be tracking who's received a warning letter and then either pull certain items from the shelves or at least let people know before they're buying it that this is an item that's received a warning letter. I'm sort of wondering, just as a matter of kind of a profession, what do you see the role of pharmacists as in terms of kind of managing this information process and transparency kind of questions?
Well, I'd be curious to know what the pharmacy faculty think about that question. But I guess my two initial thoughts are, I don't think it's necessarily practical for an individual pharmacist to prevent consumers from pulling something that's just off the shelf and not behind the pharmacy counter, unless a patient asks them about it, right? If they're getting a prescription that has some potential interaction with supplements or something like that, maybe there's an opportunity in the pharmacy consult. I think a slightly different take on the question, and sorry, I forgot to repeat it. The question was about what the role of pharmacists is in advising consumers about the potential violations associated with supplement products. I think maybe a separate spin on the question would be, should we expect the retail pharmacy industry to play a stronger role in deciding what gets stocked on the shelves of, say, Walgreens or CVS, and I think that might be I haven't thought a lot about it from a policy perspective, but that might be a more realistic expectation for, you know, a large corporation that's already making buying decisions for what goes on its shelves than for an individual pharmacist.
Yeah, and I guess there's two thoughts that come to mind. I hadn't really thought about this before. It's a very interesting question. For like a active pharmacist, a few things. One thing is that about the claims. I mean, I think that there's definitely a possibility for pharmacists to amplify the misinformation that is being promoted on the things. Like if someone goes and asks their pharmacist, what should I do about these aches and pains? And someone sends them to, if the pharmacist sends them to a supplement in the store, that's an area where I think you've got to, that doesn't have strong evidence to support, but it's available and it's marketed for joint pain. That would be an area where I think it would be interesting to, I don't know how much pharmacists are doing that or not, but that there's a potential that they could either be clarifying information or continuing to kind of spread misinformation. And then the other thing would be for that issue that we talked about, those high quality supplements that are third-party certified by USP, let's say, or NSF International. Like if a pharmacist was sending if patients are like, oh, which echinacea I could use, and then they recommend a USP brand, I think one of the tensions that might rise, like let's say a pharmacist is working for a retail brand like CVS, maybe CVS makes a lot more profit selling their non-USP version of echinacea. So, and they might, as a pharmacist, I don't know what kind of pressure they might get to either not recommend the one that makes them the least money or recommend the one that makes them the most profit in that for-profit system. So I think these are the kind of two areas where giving the right advice might be for example, you don't need a supplement for that, being maybe the best advice most of the time, might be counter to the profit motive of where they're hired from, and there's a tension with that going on.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I know with CBD, for example, the FDA has been pretty forward about stamping out really strong health claims that are made that are very specific. But how often does that actually happen with other supplements?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess so the question was, FDA has been pretty active on taking enforcement actions against products marketed as supplements with CBD in them when they're marketed with explicit disease claims like the COVID treatment claims I referenced. So the question's about how often FDA does that for other kinds of products marketed as supplements. As a brief aside, I will say about a month ago, FDA issued an announcement with respect to CBD, basically saying, we've looked at the issue. We don't think any of the current regulatory regimes are the right fit for CBD. And so we're going to work with Congress. We want to ask Congress to give us kind of a new specific authority for CBD. So I think there will be some developments potentially in the CBD area, but FDA has basically said supplement's not the right fit, pure drug is not the right fit, conventional food is not the right fit, we need something new for CBD. In terms of how often it happens for other products marketed as supplements, I think typically when there is a public health crisis like COVID, like Ebola, FDA will be will be monitoring the market for claims that a product treats that, infectious disease or that sort of public health crisis. So I think in general, FDA's enforcement priorities are based on its public health mission. So supplements, I would expect supplements marketed to treat opioid use disorder would probably be high on FDA's priority list. Supplements marketed to treat COVID would be high on FDA's priority list. So I think it just kind of depends on the disease and sort of the public health prioritization.
I agree.
Yes.
So I have two questions, and the first will be for both of you, and then the second one might be mainly for Peter and pharmacists in the room. The first one is, where does the FTC fit into all of this? Because this buyer beware type of approach that seems to be happening doesn't always replicate in other facets of the marketplace that it just seems inconsistent, particularly with some of the dangers associated with these products. Does FTC have any different authority or more or less authority?
So just in general, for FDA and FTC have overlapping authority around advertising and promotion of products. For prescription drugs, FDA has authority over prescription drug advertising. For many other drugs, including supplements and over-the-counter drugs, FDA has authority over promotional labeling. What counts as labeling under the law is quite broad. It can include websites in some circumstances, for example, but FTC has authority over the advertising. FTC typically can take action against false or misleading advertising. I am curious about Peter's thoughts, but I would expect that FTC faces many of the enforcement challenges that FDA does, with the added bonus, I guess, is probably too positive of a word, of not having the sort of same levels of in-house scientific expertise, perhaps. But I'd be
Yeah, no, it's just like you said, Patty, and the FTC does definitely get involved with the advertising of supplements, which is like the web-based. And the low-hanging fruit is both with the hottest issue, either the hottest substance like CBD or the hottest disease like COVID, and then going after things that cure that. But both the FTC and the FDA, because there's like from my understanding, the legal side, Patty, there's not many loops they have to jump through. As soon as you say it treats or cures or prevents COVID,
right.
You don't have to jump through any loops. Everything else, those warning letters, for example, everything else is so complicated to get out there. So this is like a really low-hanging fruit, both for the FTC and the FDA, and they love to crank out these letters. The question raised, I haven't studied it. We have studied this question that you were asking before, which is great. We didn't answer, actually, which is, after the FDA sends the warning letters, what's the outcome? I have a bunch of studies on this, and it's not good. But I don't have time to summarize all it. But we haven't studied that about the FTC or the FDA on the disease claims. I don't know of any studies that looked at after these warning letters if there's compliance.
I'm not aware of any studies, but I guess I'll just add warning letters are a tool FDA uses to achieve voluntary compliance. And so, as you can imagine, they work better and less well depending on the particular industry that FDA is sending a warning letter to. So a traditional prescription drug manufacturer that has a lot of products approved by FDA and works with FDA a lot is probably more likely to come into voluntary compliance than a company that has a model that is a business model that's entirely predicated on marketing unlawful products.
Yeah. And then, sorry. My second question just relates to, I'm not a pharmacist, I'm a pharmacologist, so I am very interested in the science of how these things can interact, or how they work or don't work, and specifically how they interact with pharmaceutical drugs that we know have very real mechanisms and effects. This is mainly for you, Peter, but for any pharmacists in the room, where does that information come from? Because I find that people are often surprised that their St. John's wort might interfere with a pharmaceutical or conventional drug that they might be taking. Do you, when you're working with patients, is that a conversation you have about what supplements they might be taking and how that might interface with the medications they're taking? And pharmacists, I'm curious too, for you in the room, how does that information come about at dispensing or counseling?
Yeah, I mean, the one important regulatory point that this raises is that there's no requirement to place supplement drug interactions on the labels. So, and there's also, this reminds me, no requirement to place adverse effects of the supplement on the label. So this is very important to understand. This is very different than the regulatory framework for over-the-counter medications like Tylenol and Prilosec, which require all that to be part of the labeling requirement. The problem is that when we look at, the problem is the quality of the supplements. And what we see is that a lot of supplements there really seems to be at least two major camps going on with what's actually in the supplement. There's a camp of manufacturers who are going to put the least active stuff possible, just making the cheapest product and being able to sell it and profit. There's another camp that's interested in very potent pharmaceuticals because they're trying to basically recreate drug effects by and driving their sales by, you know, like people, it might not have the desired effect, but at least it might make your heart go a little faster, or it might make you feel a little jittery or that, and then you feel like, oh, you know, this is really working really hard. So we have a number of studies that have shown how botanical supplements, like yohimbine, an example, have been formulated into really drug-like products. So it's very, very confusing. And even if you were, the problem is on the, I really think that my push is to push for the regulatory changes, because on the individual doctor-patient, I mean, I don't have enough time to even get to all the vaccines that I have. And even if my patients started telling me about every botanical they were taking, it wouldn't even, it would take so much time, and then I wouldn't even know what's actually in the bottle. So I have to keep my advice, even me, who's like, this is what I do for my research, I have to keep things really simple in clinic. And I'm looking for like my patients who are taking really high-risk supplements and trying to counsel them sort of leaning away from that and moving toward a safer practice.
Okay. I think we have a time for one more question. Yes?
Last question. So I'm from the drug discovery side, so please forgive if I don't understand patient interactions. So fundamentally, this is obviously a very complicated question. Any plant extract is going to have a wide variety of compounds in it, many of which may be drug-like, most of which have not been studied in any way, shape, or form. It sounds like the policy revision you're asking for is like a bare minimum. Is there any room to give it some kind of teeth, some kind of analysis, some kind of GMP certification, anything of that nature?
Right, great question. So one of those reform ideas that we didn't have time to get into addresses this question. So as I mentioned, and what you're pointing out is that let's just take, if you take any individual plant and you use the roots versus the leaves, right? And then that is dramatically different in terms of those complex mixture of chemicals. And it also, of course, is how you extract that, right? If you're extracting with water and ethanol to that. So that's going to change all this. So yeah, I don't think it's realistic, but I think that defining, like there is for, prescription drugs, USP, US Pharmacopoeia, creates a recipe that everyone has to follow, and you have to follow this recipe to make those drugs. So like, if you're making Tylenol, there's only one way to do it. It's not like the company can be like, oh, we're going to figure out how to make Tylenol at 100 milligrams and then just do it. They have to use an actual recipe. So that's the opposite in supplements. So we could see a world where you had recipes for preparing echinacea, for example, and you can only market those as echinacea. And the other pathway, possible rational approach to this would be to say anything that's not that traditional echinacea preparation has to go through what's called the a new dietary ingredient application process. We haven't talked about this, but there's a very little used process by which new supplements, so that would be all these different things. You use a new extraction method. You try to increase the amount of, yohimbine and yohim, you name it. You have to go through that process. And that process requires the manufacturer to submit some basic safety information to the FDA, and the FDA to acknowledge that receipt prior to going to sale. So if you had, and one of our suggestions is to require anything that differs from the absolute traditional approach or traditional amount to go through that NDI process that we haven't talked about. So absolutely, that would be essential for a rational, a rational system.
All right. Well, our time is up. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Let's give the speakers a round of applause. Thank you so much, everybody.